Welcome to Talk to Brazil with Tom Reaoch, the business connector to business in Brazil. Welcome to Talk to Brazil, the business connection, the world's first English language internet radio program about business in Brazil since 2009 and now in podcast format. I'm Tom Reaoch, an American living in Brazil for many years and known as the King of Networking, and talking from my studio in Campinas, São Paulo, Brazil. Today's guest is Alex Foessel. He's a specialist in R&D, as well as robotics, innovation, and manufacture 4.0. Alex and I are members of the Future Advisory Board at the ACIC Campinas, which is the Campinas Commercial and Industrial Association. And Alex joins us today from Santiago, Chile. So with that, Alex, hello and welcome back to Talk to Brazil, the Business Connection.
Good morning, Tom, and thank you for inviting me back.
Alex, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and always even more of a pleasure to have you on the podcast. But last August, you were here on the program, and we talked about Brazil business, and at that time, we were looking forward to the year 2025, right? And since August until today, a lot has happened in the world. But, and remember, we talked about automation, autonomy, technology, innovation, robotics. We even talked about Pittsburgh, talked about Brazil as a hub. What's changed and what's the same?
Well, a lot has changed, Tom. And of course, when we look at August 2019 to now April of 2020, we have seen major changes and major situations like the virus affecting globally the context for business as it relates to automation, but really affecting the context for business in a very comprehensive way. So when you ask me what stays the same, I believe that the key things that are stay the same is this relentless pursuit for becoming more and more robust businesses. I was reading an article where many CFOs and CEOs would state that 2020 was a lost year. Mm-hmm. It may seem that way from a short-term perspective, right? But when you think that you are working for the next 10, 20 years, I would like to look at the glass half full and highlight that such a pandemic has really challenged the resilience and the robustness of businesses.
Right.
And the world is going to come out with an overall manufacturing supply base with more diversity. And this will more distributed. This in turn will provide a ability for businesses to take on future challenges with much more robustness, resilience. So the sustainability of the economy certainly is being put to test. However, I think that we're going to come out with a stronger economies, more resilient supply chains, more robust manufacturing, and overall a strengthened e-commerce all around that will further the economic development. So again, it's to provide a longer term view that sees this year not as a lost year, but the year where we tested.
A year where it's a repositioning, right? We're at a repositioning moment. And for our listeners, Alex, you've lived and worked in Germany, Europe. You've lived and worked in the United States. You've lived and worked here in Brazil. You've lived and work right now in Chile. So you do have a global view and a lot of experience in what has happened, what is happening, and what can happen. And when you're talking about e-commerce, when you're talking about the logistics, that's still the same the whole world, right?
Yes and no. What I would say is that the pandemic and the drive to contain the spread of the disease by staying at home has certainly caused a surge in the demand for delivery. A surge for the demand so that many more businesses are working towards having an online presence. And of course, the most commonly cited example is Amazon. But when I look into any email that is coming from my Chilean bank or my Brazilian bank, or even in the U.S., you see all these offers with, promotions and the banks promoting us to go and purchase online,
right,
and more secure credit cards, etc. So you look into even the finance industry is promoting an online economy. The challenge with that is that there's no e-commerce that is not backed up by a robust and solid logistics chain.
Right.
And we're talking about, the last mile, the warehousing, the delivery from suppliers, the international commerce. All of those pieces need to be in place so that the promise and the expectations, the customer expectations of a good being delivered to their homes is going to be fulfilled. And Tom, I think that the virus has created a surge of demand that right now companies are fulfilling by hiring people. This is the brute force approach. It's like, and this doesn't really scale too well, because that means training, means making sure that you have the proper health practices inside of warehouses and inside of distribution centers. It means also that you're positioning people that may have been left without a job in other industries, train them and get them inside of a warehouse or a delivery system. So this comes with a number of challenges. And going back to your original question, robotics, automation, and these kind of technologies are going to become significantly more relevant in the longer term.
Right. Well, if we take your example right now of the virus, what you see, we're watching television, let's take the example of hospitals, even manufacturing sites, of using robots to go in and disinfect, to clean, from where you don't even want a person to go in. But if you don't have the robot, if the robot's not there, and if it's not ready, it's not capable to do that, then you have to put a person into an environment that you probably wouldn't want to do. So I can see that change happening, even in hotels. They clean a hotel room or have robots now go down the hall and clean up the hallway instead of having a person. So I think there's a drive. Offices, shopping centers. Today, if the robots were available, I'm sure people would be buying them and using them. So I can see a demand coming from robots that wasn't thought about 3 months ago.
Exactly. And that is because of, you are really making the overall system, the overall business more resilient to, in the future, infections or even to contain the existing virus. Now the challenge is that not all those robots are ready. Not all those automation are ready to be deployed. But there's a couple areas where I believe that we're going to start seeing significant developments. For example, one of those is the area of collaborative robots. And to make a robot to do all the functions, for example, of a human in a warehouse, to go pick a couple items that are going to go into a box later to be closed, sealed, and shipped to be delivered, that's really complex because it requires, a number of abilities to pick and place and find, etc. But what robots do very well today in many warehouses and factories in the world is to go from one place to another, avoid obstacles and humans, and get to where they know the goods are. So the collaboration, now the robots become assistants to humans and increase the productivity and the quality of the job that humans are doing significantly. And I believe that after companies right now scale up their e-commerce logistics by just hiring people, we're going to see a trend towards adopting automation from a collaborative way. And the beauty of this is that once you have a team, you want to keep a team. Any business,
right.
That has already a set of employees who are well trained, who will work as a team, etc. The last thing that you want to do is to put their jobs at risk. All the contrary, you want to give them the tools to become a better team, to deliver more productivity, more throughput. And that's where the automation technology from a collaborative point of view comes and plays so nicely, because that makes each one of the employees way more productive, way more precise, and the overall e-commerce logistics is executed in an even more profitable way. So I think that's something that is you're going to see that with significantly more emphasis than what I would have suggested in our August podcast.
Right. Well, let me ask another question. In August, we talked about Pittsburgh. For our listeners, I'm from Pittsburgh. I was born there. And I think when we talked in August, I mentioned the transformation of a city from a manufacturing, Pittsburgh's the steel city, very basic steel manufacturing. The city has transformed itself into a technology base, and more recently, it's become a base for robotics, which I'm sure most people don't even know, right? And when you talk about robotics and robots, everybody tends to think China and other places. But and you've been to Pittsburgh and you've seen that. What makes Pittsburgh so special in terms of robotics?
You're asking me a tough question because I will have to go back to Carnegie Mellon, where I got my PhD in robotics. And
that's a good start.
I am myself. But I think that the Carnegie Mellon it does have a tremendous role here by producing a significant number of engineers and scientists and researchers and even business people with enough familiarity with automation and robotics that they have become really good at turning technology into businesses. And we have seen a number of companies that have become successful, but also we have seen, for example, the Strip District, which is adjacent to one of the rivers. That used to be mostly a very nice place with old warehouses and markets and things like that. Today they have the robotic row, I believe that is what they refer to, and then you have a number of really Argo AI, and then you have the Carnegie Robotics, and then you have the Robotics Engineering Center, and many others. Apple is also investing, etc., putting large buildings or the restoration of buildings that can host a number of engineers working not necessarily in building the robots, but certainly in building the technology that will make robots intelligent. I'm thinking of Bossa Nova, for example, who belongs to a good friend of mine, who recently got the contract to deploy robots that roam inside of the hallways of Walmarts across the USA, so that they can actually take inventory of all of the goods in each one of the that the inventory that needs to be present there for customers to buy is there. So
what you're saying then, that we always talk about the Silicon Valley, and so what you just said, Pittsburgh has become the Robot Valley.
Yes, and that expression, Roboberg, was coined maybe 20 years ago, but I believe that today it really honors the reality where many companies are going in there. Uber also has significant part of their Uber technology group developing autonomous vehicles. By the way, just a side comment, the development of autonomous cars is going through a little bit of a blip. And that is because they are not able to necessarily do the physical testing of vehicles out in the streets
right.
and validating that the technology is mature. But we should not believe that is slowing down, because most of these companies like Aurora, Waymo, or others, they have developed such sophisticated simulation platforms that they can run significant number of different cases out in simulation, so that development of algorithms and making these vehicles smarter and safer continues.
Right.
So that is one example of maybe an area of automation that has slowed down a bit, but that is really on the surface.
But you mentioned a robot going through the corridors of a retail store, right? And I'm not an engineer, and I don't profess to be, but the technology to make a robot or to make something be autonomous, and the movements to go up and down, turn right, turn left, go forward, come backward, and you put that to an automobile, you put that to other types of machinery. And we see it even in Brazil today. We have a lot of heavy equipment in terms of mining that's become autonomous. So it's going up and down, going round and round, being loaded, offloaded. Agriculture, you have a lot of equipment that's become autonomous. So again, when we think of autonomy, it's more expansive than just automobiles, right?
Absolutely. And I would say, Tom, since you mentioned that if there's something that, for example, cleaning robots in factories or warehouses, inventory robots in supermarkets, mining robots in mine sites. There's one thing, though, that they all have in common, and that is the environment of operation is somewhat well structured, and the access is somewhat contained. So in other words, you can limit the risk and the liability of the operation of these autonomous robots by reducing the number of people or controlling the access of these people, or training these people to have proper safety practices. The challenge with autonomous cars, and that's why we see CEOs of known brands, for example, Ford announced that they were going to postpone the deployment of autonomous cars until 2022 at the earliest. That is just showing how tough is to deploy robots, in this case autonomous cars, in streets, because the environment is not structured. It has significant number of special cases, and just to create the level of safety assurance is significantly more complex than in areas where the environment is more structured or the access is controlled.
No, I don't want to make anybody think that I think it's simple. But the more we see, and the more development we see from artificial intelligence and learning, what I've seen, the learning part of anything has become a lot faster than it was in the past. And part of learning faster is having access, obviously, to more data, right? We're talking about the virus, right? The more we learn every day is because there's more data available. The more data available, the more conclusions you can come to. So part of that, and I can see that, of not having the ability to go out in the streets and gain that may be a hindrance. But I'm sure there's somebody out there thinking of how to do that and simulate it in another way. And whoever does it faster sooner is going to be on top. So.
Another dimension, Tom, since you mentioned that, is that you mentioned ag. So we have seen in ag, both in Brazil as well as in the U.S. and in other markets, tractors that guide themselves. So the operator is there, is taking care of the job that needs to be done. But these vehicles are really self-driven, in the sense that the precision GPS guidance is providing them with the ability to go back and forth and to the end turns, etc. Still, I think that's because of the liability context in the U.S., we're going to see some longer time until the adoption of those technologies happens more broadly. I still believe that Brazil, in that sense, has a great opportunity in showing that you can provide the broader adoption of those technologies and show that the increase of the productivity out in the field is going to continuously make Brazil more competitive. So this has two sides. There's the logistics and the ports and the infrastructure, and there's more work to be done there, even though a lot has been done by opening grain paths up north. Still the efficiency, the operational efficiency of the soybeans or the corn, the cotton, and even livestock. Brazil has a tremendous opportunity into improving their efficiency, production efficiency, and profitability by adoption of more data, documentation, and automation technologies. I'm really excited about that piece myself.
You should be, because we see that happening. That's been the case to Brazil. So if you can see, it's a country where you can have 3 harvests, which I guess might be the only place in the whole world. The productivity that's been gained here in a number of different crops, in terms of animal cultures, the same thing. I think when we talk about the word disruptive and innovation, I think there's obviously more incentive here in Brazil. But you mentioned a word that's important when you talk about the United States, when you said liability. I'm not saying it's not important, but sometimes it becomes a barrier to innovation, right? Just recently, we've seen that there are a number of meat processing plants that have closed down because of the virus. But the CEOs of some of those companies are more worried about the liability. And that's a question of opening up. So that word liability becomes a barrier for business in some places. And it's not that liability is not an issue in Brazil, but I think the expanse of the drive from farmers or from manufacturers has actually helped innovation become reality here.
Yes, I agree. The key difference is that in the context of business in Brazil, product liability certainly exists, but not to the same level of risk to the business as in the U.S. And also that is even balanced by the liability related to labor laws and making sure that all of the leyes trabalhistas, right? All the labor laws are being respected. At times, for a business, those become more of a liability than the product liability itself. And in that sense, those two business contexts are very different, Tom. That's why I was alluding earlier that maybe Brazil should continue to consider that it should not always adopt technology that is coming from other markets, but Brazil can become a place where good technology gets developed, is tested in a very challenging and complex operation, and that technology can be exported as well in the future.
Right. Well, you've been here and you've worked here. You can see that the level of engineering, the level of sophistication of the Brazilian work is very high. It's comparable to Germany, to the United States, to China. So there is the intellectual competence. There is the drive here that exists.
And even the manufacturing competency as well, Tom. Brazil, for good or bad, but through the promotion of local manufacturing, I think has developed a manufacturing base that may become relevant now that companies, as we were talking at the beginning of the podcast, are trying to diversify their supply base. So I'm wondering to what extent manufacturing of some things that would have been typically out in the East may come down to Brazil potentially.
Well, part of what we're doing and part of my drive with Talk to Brazil is to get information out, to communicate to the world about Brazil as a business opportunity, and talking and speaking with people like yourself. Brazil is still a great unknown. when you talk about manufacturing, when you talk about companies. And we have to agree, it's not agriculture. It's probably on the front page and the front line of most concepts, but there are a number of other areas that are as important. But many foreign companies don't see it that way.
Correct. Yes. So I think that from that point of view, I think that is a responsibility of those of us who actually have a perspective or a view in the two markets and countries, meaning USA and Brazil, to continue highlighting both ways the opportunities.
And there are opportunities. So what we can say moving forward is that business opportunities looking forward to 2025 are as strong as we mentioned in August, right?
Yes. And that is maybe the
and actually it's probably more, right?
Well, that exactly. And going back to my comment, the virus has caused a surge, an unexpected surge in demand for e-commerce, delivery, remote packaging and logistics. And that surge is being today satisfied by, almost like a brute force approach of scaling up the number of people. But that is not sustainable long term. So, what is sustainable long term is that we continue streamlining those logistics, streamlining and automating, and running this with a lot of care for metrics and measuring and productivity, and that is going to show that the companies that are going to have the profitability they're looking for are the ones that are going to be shifting from scaling up in people to scaling up in technology integration, like this collaborative robots that I was mentioning a bit earlier.
So a lot happening, and you're going to be a busy person.
I'm excited about this, Tom. Of course, no one wanted, no one expected, no one desired a pandemic. But I think that we should, once again, consider this in a horizon of 20 years,
right? Where
2020 is the year that tested or stressed our existing business models, right, supply chains, and technology, and prepare ourselves for a much more sustainable, resilient, right, robust, and profitable next 20 years.
What you said, it's the stress test, right? And it was a global stress test that everybody's going through right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. Well, I want to thank you, Alex. We're coming to the end of our time. I want to thank you for sharing your time, speaking with us again in Santiago, Chile. I know you're going to be coming back to Brazil shortly, and we'll be back, and we'll be wanting to talk to you in the future to see how things are going in all of these areas, okay?
And I'll be delighted to, Tom. Yes, going back to Brazil shortly, because I believe that the new normal, as we sometimes is being discussed, the new normal is being planned and defined today.
Right.
And we need to put we should not wait until the lockdown is released, or there's a number of ways to collaborate, and the new normal is being defined today. That is what I would like to leave you with.
And that's true, and I agree with you, and that's what we're trying to do today. All right?
Tom, always a pleasure coming here to your podcast. Thank you very much for inviting me again.
Okay, and thank you for sharing your time with our listeners. And you can also find, for our listeners, you can find more about Alex Foessel on LinkedIn, and you also find more about Talk to Brazil on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Google Podcasts. I'd like to thank our audience and our sponsor, Focus MI Market Intelligence. Focus MI specializes in market research for the Brazilian agricultural market, and more about them on their site, which is focusmi.com. Visit our website, talktobrazil.com, and find more of our previous shows about and other interviews. So remember, when you talk to Tom, you talk to Brazil and the world. Goodbye, and thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to Tom Reaoch on Talk to Brazil, the business connector to Brazil.